We are in the middle, we are in the middle of the 10th chapter of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes, and we are discussing a series of verses, which, as we said, as we began talking about last week, these are, there's an interesting lesson in these verses. So as you know, if you've been around for a while here in this class, we've our theory, our reigning theory over the entire, our thesis, if you will, over the entire book of Kohelet, is that it is, while people understand it to be a bit of a downer of a book, it's really an empowering book. I wouldn't say it's a happy book. I wouldn't say it's, but it's empowering. It's teaching us how to utilize happiness and how to utilize wisdom as a sort of as a guide for life. These verses show us a very interesting aspect of wisdom, and that is that the wise person is willing to realize that there's things that they don't understand, and they're willing to accept questions and actually delve into questions that are perhaps uncomfortable. And that's what we see over here. And he, of course, he shows this to us with the big one, the big question, if you will, the big question that affects, that is just kind of the source of many other questions, and it's the thing that's thrown many people off of the path of God, specifically the question of how do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. The real, if you will, the big long Jewish take on it is the book of Job. That's where we really get into it as Jewish theology, philosophy, etc. is usually in the book of Job, but he touches on it here in the book of Kohelet. Different authors, by the way. It's unclear exactly who the author of Job is, but according to our tradition, the Talmud at least records it as being having been written by Moses himself. Anyway, but we're not doing a class on Job right now. Maybe one day. But as it is, so he touches on it here in these verses over here. And as I warned last week, he's going to be going on a bit of a bunch of versions of the same question. How could it be that this happens? How could it be that that happens? What we're going to see this week is actually he starts off with the kind of the question in the regular form of good things happening to bad people, bad things happening to good people. But then eventually it kind of just turns into this just divine injustice in general, of what we would perceive as divine injustice, not specifically to good or bad people necessarily, but just in general. So that's what we're going to see this week. We're going to be starting with verse number 7. So let's jump into the screen share. Okay, there's that. You know what? I just want to peek back for 1 second at the last verse first, so that we get back into the context of it, because that's going to be interesting. There's going to be an interesting contrast between the two verses. The last verse of last week, verse number 6, and the first verse of this week, verse number 7. Again, kind of a warning is that we're not going to come to a satisfying conclusion to this. Again, that's okay. That's kind of, I think, more than anything, is that's the lesson. It's okay to have the question and not necessarily have a good answer, or kind of sit with the question for a while and be okay with that. So if you look at the last verse of last week, this is verse number 6. He says, Nitan hasechel bamromim, the fool, and we talk about sechel being a specific type of fool, but the fool is placed in the high, bamromim rabim, in many high places, right? So you find in general that fools seem to occupy the high places. Every side of the political spectrum definitely believes that about the other side, right? Va'ashirim ba'shifel yeshevu, while the wealthy sit in the low station. Okay, so we have this contrast here between the high places and the low places. And we said last week that it's interesting that he places, or he puts the fool versus the wealthy person. I think that's just, and we said last week that I think it's just because the in people's minds, you would imagine a wealthy person would occupy a high station. There's no, it doesn't make sense otherwise. Why would a wealthy person not, they have the connections, they've got the money, they've got everything that they need. They should be able to occupy the high stations. But in reality, you will find that you will have Ashirim Basheful Yeshevu, the wealthy people dwelling in the lowly places. So we had over here again, the point that I want to bring out that's going to connect to this week is we have a discussion. Both sides of the spectrum over here are dwelling in places. Okay, the fool is in the heights. The wealthy person is in the low spots. Okay. Now we could take a look at this week's verse, first verse this week, and we'll see an interesting contrast there between this week and next week and last week. Okay. And we say like this: Re'iti avadim al susim. I have seen servants or slaves on horses. Visarim holachim ka'avadim al haaretz, and ministers or officers or some sort of official walking like slaves on the ground. Okay, once again, Re'iti avadim al susim. I have seen slaves on horses. Visarim holachim ka'avadim al haaretz, and ministers or officers walking like slaves on the ground. So this one's a much more clear, contrast. We clearly have a very clear spectrum. You have slaves, which culturally are the lowest that you'll find, the lowest rung on the ladder, right? The slave doesn't have anything of their own. They are entirely dependent on their master. They are at the mercy of their master. So really, culturally, they're the lowest group on the ladder. Thank God we don't have that anymore nowadays. But through most of the world history, that was the case, that there were cultures that were enslaved by other cultures, right? So that's really, you can't imagine much lower of a thing. In fact, when the sages want to point out that every Jewish person received some level of prophecy at the splitting of the sea when they were leaving Egypt, they say that even a slave woman saw more things than the greatest of the prophets. Okay, so again, you see that in the culturally, the slave is the lowest on the rung on the ladder. So he says, I have seen slaves riding on horses, which is interesting that he says I've seen it. So this is not a theoretical necessarily. He's saying I have witnessed this myself. When? I'm not sure. I'm sure, I didn't see anyone who said where exactly King Solomon saw this. But he says, I have seen it. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the officers who are walking like slaves on the ground. We know that from like the story of the Purim story in the book of Esther, right? So usually you would have the important person riding on the horse, and you'd have the lowly person walking the horse through the street, right? That's to signify that the person walking the horse is in a much lower station. Okay, so just so you know, I think somebody might have their mic on. Heard some noise there. So, okay, so these are again very clear contrasts between the two of these. You have the slaves on horses and the ministers or officers walking on the ground. What I wanted to point out is based on the last verse. The last verse was static. Okay, look at this last verse over here. That the fool has been placed. In fact, that's actually a past tense nitan. He has been placed. The fool has been placed in the many high places, and the wealthy sit in the low places, sit plural in the low places. Over here we have an action. So that was static. Nothing occurred necessarily in that verse. Here we have an action. Okay, and in the action it says not only do people end up in seemingly unfitting stations, but in fact people through their actions end up in stations that they don't belong in. I think that's an important point, and this is something that's this is what you get when you pay attention to the tenses and the words of the text, is that you find if you just saw, some people are just born into wealth, or born into privilege, or born into their station in life, you'd say, okay, that's the way of the world. They didn't do anything for it. If only people knew that they were fools, they wouldn't occupy such a station. Or if only they had been born in a little different situation, okay, then they would have been better. Of course they ended up lowly, or because they didn't do anything. The wealthy person just didn't do anything to get out of the low places. What we have over here in this verse is you can have people who are actively doing something. They're working, and they're actually putting in physical action. And nevertheless, you seem to find this dichotomy of why of somebody who's should not be in a high station is in a high station, and somebody who's actively working, who's doing something, who should be in a low station is in a high station. All right, so you've got this again. That's an interesting point over here. It shows you that it's not just you're either born lucky or you're not. It's even because usually the argument would be, okay, so you're born unlucky, you're born in a bad station, so put some work in and you'll get to the next rung on the ladder. Well, this would say, look, we've got people who are putting their work in, right? These are and still something's off over here. The slave ends up running the show. The officer, the high position, ends up working for everybody else. So that seems to be a dichotomy. Again, kind of giving a hint to this general idea of why are people getting what they don't deserve, and why are people who do deserve things not getting what they deserve. I think I said that right. You're right. People are getting things that they didn't work for, and people are not getting things that they did work for. Okay. So that's again another kind of rung in this ladder of this doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. Okay. That takes us to our next verse. And not that much to say on that verse. That takes us to this next verse over here. And this is an interesting verse for a number of reasons. Let's translate it first. It says, Chofer gumatz. If somebody digs a pit, bo yipo, that person will fall in that pit. Uforetz gader, and somebody who breaks down a wall, yishechenu nachash, will be bit by a snake. Okay, let's read that one more time. Chofer gumatz, one who digs a pit, bo yipol, will fall into it himself. Uforetz gader, and somebody who tears down a wall, yishechenu nachash, will be bit by the snake. So there's a number. Well, just one thing that kind of stood out to me when I was reading the verse was this gumatz over here. Somebody who digs a gumatz. So it's clear from the context that it's a pit. In fact, there is another word, guma, which means a pit, both in Aramaic, in Talmudic Hebrew, and in modern Hebrew. Apparently, also I looked it up last night. A guma is a pit in modern Hebrew. There is no other occurrence of this form gumatz anywhere in Tanakh. Okay, it does not exist anywhere else. So it is strange that he decided to give us a version of the word that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's almost like I'm still trying to figure out what he wanted us to see from there. It's strange. It just doesn't kind of. It would be a weird thing for him to do, to use a word that we never find anywhere else. But that seems to be what he did. Nevertheless, the meaning is clear. You have a person who digs a pit, and he falls into the pit all by himself, right? The same guy who digs the pit ends up falling in the pit, okay? Similarly, somebody is breaking down a wall, so that's supposed to be some sort of protection for the person, and in the process of breaking down the wall, they get bit by a snake. So they're in the middle of doing some sort of action that releases the snake, and he's the guy who gets bit by the snake. Okay, the sages over here bring a very they love this verse. This verse shows up all over the Talmud, particularly the second half of it, because they say that they use this as just general phraseology to refer to whenever a person, the sages over many centuries put in a lot of safeguards to the law, and so things almost extrajudicial law. So they said, if this is what the Torah says, but we want to take it a step further, and then they warned that we've placed a wall around the Torah to guard it, and somebody who breaks down that wall may get bit by a snake. Okay, in other words, it's your own risk that you take matters lightly. All right, so that's not a literal usage of the verse. It's not what the verse means in context, but it is a common use of the phrase "Horetz gader yishachenu nachash," that if somebody breaks down a wall, they put themselves at risk for getting bit by a snake. This is what you see from this verses. So he gives us two cases. Now, these cases are not opposites of each other. Okay, they're not. One's not the good guy, one's not the bad guy, as we had in the last couple of verses. Right, the last two verses we had the fool versus the wealthy person. We had the slave versus the officer. In this verse, we don't have this versus that. We've got one person who's doing an action, and it becomes a danger for himself, and another person does an action, and it's also a danger for themselves too. And it's their own fault, in other words. They create the danger, and they fall into it, okay? So, in other words, this is another case where we're setting the stage for another verse that's going to tell us, let me put this the right way. We are giving you a chance to think one thing, and then we're going to take it down in the next verse. So here's how I look at it. You have this verse over here, and it says, well, you have somebody who digs a pit. Digging a pit is a destructive act, right? They're taking, the ground was safe, there was nothing wrong with it, and they've gone ahead and they take a shovel, they dig a pit, and then without, they don't consider the consequences of their actions. So they fall into the pit, right? So the same pit that they dug is what they fall into. Similarly, you have a wall, so you have a protection around you. Person is protected, is naturally protected by the wall around them, and they tear down the wall and they make themselves open for danger. You look in the commentaries, you actually find a number of different explanations about where this proverbial snake is coming from. Some opinions are learning that the snake is hidden in the wall and was perfectly happy, undisturbed in the wall. And when you start pulling, when the person in the proverb starts pulling down the stones of the wall, that's what released the snake or stirred up the snake from its nest. Another explanation was that the wall is there specifically to protect people from snakes, and so by tearing down the wall, you've now made it possible for snakes to come and attack. There was another explanation that I saw, another one of the commentaries, who said that actually both these guys are bad guys. Again, this is just put it in very simple terms. These are both bad guys. Why is the guy digging the pit? Why is the first person digging the pit? They're digging in order somebody else could fall into it and they could, steal their money or something like that. The second person is going and tearing down the wall in order so that they could release these snakes onto other people. Okay, so these are both bad people. And what's interesting is they're both bad people, but they're both getting punished, which is a veering away from what we've been talking about. We've been talking about bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. Here we take it kind of a different direction. So I'm avoiding that explanation. I don't necessarily see that it has to be that these people are doing this in order to hurt other people. I think in the other sense, I think it's more just what we see is that people are doing an action, and through their action, they the very thing that they are trying to improve, they put themselves in danger. Again, getting to that just general question of divine injustice. Again, divine injustice. I'm just going to put that in quotation marks because injustice is based on our point of view. But what would appear to be divine injustice extends to this. You have somebody who dedicates themselves to one action. They dedicate themselves to digging this pit, and they're the one who gets hurt by it. You have somebody, this person dedicates themselves to tearing down this wall, and they're the one who gets bit by the snake. So it doesn't make sense in our minds that the thing that you intended to improve is going to be your own downfall. Okay? With this verse, although we have, is that both of these are destructive actions. So the argument again can be made, oh, well, yeah, of course they're going to get hurted because they're not taking precautions. They're not taking the necessary precautions for safety. They dig a pit and they fall into the pit. Well, don't do destructive actions that you're going to, that may end up with consequences. Meaning it's in the destructiveness of it that it creates this possibility for their own consequences, which is what the next verse is now going to come and undo that way of thinking. Okay, so again, just like we had 2 verses ago, that it was coming to override your thinking from the verse before. That's what it's doing over here with verse number 9. Okay. And verse number 9 says like this: Masia avanim, one who transports stones, ye'atzev bahem, will be made sad by them. Bokea itzim, and somebody who cuts wood or who chops wood, yisachen bam, will be put in danger by the wood. Okay, again, masia avanim ye'atzev bahem, somebody who transports stones will be made sad by them. Bokea itzim yisachen bam, and the one who chops wood will be put in danger by the wood. Okay, so with this, just to take care of this first thing first, is masia is an interesting word. I would have thought, and this is actually, there are a number of commentaries that go this direction, that masia avanim is a stone cutter. Okay, is somebody who cuts stone. So that would mean somebody who goes to the mountain, a rocky mountain of some sort, and hacks stone, hews stone out of the mountain. It does not seem to be that's the shortage of the word. Masia does not seem to actually indicate that. We have perhaps other words for that. I'd have to think about what they are. But usually, I don't think we'd usually use the word masia to mean a stone hewer, to hew stones, H-E-W. Rather, masia, the root seems to be, sa means to transport or to move. In fact, in this verse, in this week's Torah portion, it says, "Vayhi bin soa Aaron vayomer Moshe," that when the ark was moving, when the Jewish people would move the ark in their travels, Moses would say a phrase. He said a certain phrase when they moved the ark. So that's the masia. Instead, it really seems to indicate transportation. One of the commentaries says it means cutting the stones and then transporting them. Okay, so they kind of covered all their bases with that. Literally, again, I believe literally the word means transportation. So he's transporting the stones, and he himself, this person himself, is saddened by these stones. That's also interesting. Why is it saddened? And then the contrast being in the next half of the verse, that the one who chops wood is endangered by the wood. It's kind of strange that the first one would be saddened and the second one would be endangered. So this is again another case where we have two more dangerous jobs, but they are causing the very person who's engaged in them to be put in danger, or to go through some sort of difficulty. So one thing I want to point out, though, is that the last verse was destructive, right? He's digging a hole. You have flat dirt, and the person digs a hole into the dirt. You've got a wall that's there to guard, to protect, and then the wall is torn down. Here we have the opposite. These are constructive, okay? These are things that person is doing constructively as opposed to destructively. So they are either hewing stones. Again, that's almost why I don't want to say hewing stones, because that almost sounds destructive itself. Instead, it's transporting stones. So the person's bringing building materials to the place, and that itself becomes a source of sadness for them. They are chopping wood to build something, to create something, and that itself becomes a form of danger. So again, as opposed to the last verse, which was destructive, this is constructive. So again, in the last verse, we almost wanted to say, you could trick yourself almost into saying, well, of course they're acting destructively. Of course they're putting themselves in danger. They're opening themselves up for consequences. This verse seems to indicate no. Even if a person's acting constructively with good intentions in mind and all that, then it's still there's still a possibility of suffering a consequence. Okay, so that seems to be the contrast, or the difference between this verse and the last verse. So this verse is kind of tell you, don't just think it's because they're acting destructively. It's because they're acting, even if they're acting constructively, you're into the same situation, that this divine justice seems to be out of whack. Somebody who's doing, I get it, especially if we want to learn that the last verse was with bad intentions, right? Like one of the commentaries wanted to read that the person's digging the hole and tearing down the wall to hurt other people. This verse, everyone agrees, is doing it, the person's doing it for the right reasons. They want to create something, they want to build, they want to contribute to society, and nevertheless, it's causing problems. So again, we've moved away. He's not necessarily going directly with a simple good things happening to bad people, bad things happening to good people. He started with that. They actually kind of shifted away from that. And really what more he wanted to focus on was just the fact that things just don't seem to make sense. It's strange that a person could make something and be destroyed by the work of their own hands. It reminds me of Moby Dick almost, right? Moby Dick is my favorite book. My favorite book ever. I absolutely love Moby Dick. I'm strange in that way. I was lucky enough not to read it in high school. I only read it as an adult, so I didn't get it ruined by teachers. So in fact, I didn't even know what the ending was. I somehow had sheltered myself from the surprise ending of Moby Dick. So I'm going to spoil that for you now, in case you haven't caught up in the past 160 years, 180 years. So Moby Dick ends with crazy Captain Ahab having the Pequod, the ship, sink because he's chasing after this white whale, and he will not let go. And at the last moment, the whale just tears the ship apart, and the only survivor is the narrator, Ishmael. So, all right, that's the very, very in a nutshell version of Moby Dick. So you have somebody who, it makes him his life's mission is to go and do this thing, this crazy Captain Ahab, whose entire life mission is to go and exact retribution for the loss of his own leg from this white whale that he lost his leg to many years ago. He finally finds it, and then he loses everything because he's so myopic about needing to do this one thing. He can't let it go, and again suffers and dies by his own works. So I'm kind of reminded of that over here. We've got the guy who's digging the pit and tearing down the wall and cutting the stones and chopping the wood. Each one of these dies or suffers by the hand of the very work that they work at, and it doesn't match what we understand in how our brains work with how justice should be. Have the guy die some other way, have the person suffer in some other way, but the thing that they work at, that's what's going to hurt them. It's hard for us to fathom. There was one other thing I wanted to point out on this verse over here, which kind of stood out to me. Somebody who transports stones is not directly involved with cutting stones. Okay, if I want to say that Masiya does not mean hewing stones, it actually means to transport stones. I think that's more fitting for the terminology that's used. So they don't actually directly engage with the stones. They also don't directly get hurt. It says that they are saddened by them. Somebody else they know gets hurt or whatever it is. I'm kind of filling in the story, filling in the plot as to what happens, but the stones that they are transporting cause them sadness. We have had before, atsev means sadness. So ye atsev bahem, the person will be saddened by these stones, as opposed to the wood chopper, who directly engages with the wood, directly gets hurt by the wood. I just find that to be interesting. That I don't know if there's a lesson there. I'm sure there is, but the one who is indirectly involved with their craft is also indirectly hurt. The one who is directly involved with their craft is directly hurt. Just kind of a thought, something to kind of mull over. I don't have a specific explanation on why that would be. So what we have in each one of these verses is the person who's engaging with this either destructive or constructive or good thing or bad thing. They all seem to be ending up in this painful predicament at the end of it, right? Whether it's, again, falling in the pit, getting bit by a snake, being saddened, or being actually directly endangered by it. There's this sense that these people, no matter what they do, they are put in danger. Their lives are adversely affected by what they're doing. So again, what does the logic dictate? The logic dictates, well, I know why, because they're not being careful, right? They're not taking the precautions. They're not acting safety first. They're not using the buddy system or preventing forest fires or anything, right? They're acting irresponsibly, and that's why they're getting hurt. Meaning, if I were to want to answer this, I would say, yeah, it's because they're acting irresponsibly. You act responsibly, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, right? You take proper precautions, everything's going to be okay. And that's what our last verse of the evening, verse number 10, is going to come and challenge. Okay, this is a difficult verse to translate. It took me a couple different tries, a couple different translations and commentaries to figure out what it is. But now I think I got an understanding of what's going on here. Okay, actually, this is a very famous verse. The sages have a lot of explanations about what this verse is referring to. But let's go into what the translation is. Im keha habarzel. If the iron is dull, okay, dull, D-U-L-L. Vihu lo fanim kilkal. And the person who owns it, who has the iron, does not sharpen the point, all right, or does not do something to the point. V'chayelim yigaber, and the armies overpower, are able to, or are victorious. V'yitron hachsher chachma, and the wisdom is to prepare more. Okay, that's kind of disjointed. So let's take that again. Let's go through the verse one more time, just what the words mean, and then we'll explain it. Imkeha barzel. If the iron is dull, v'hulo fanim kilkal, and the person who's working with the iron does not sharpen the point, does not sharpen the edge. V'chayalim yigaber, and the armies overpower or are victorious. V'yitron hachsher chachma, and wisdom is in increasing preparation. Okay. So, again, disjointed verse, as we've had a lot of different places. What I seem to understand, and again, this is based on a number of the commentaries, but it's also, it seems to be what's going on over here, is that we're talking about a situation. He says, I've seen, again, this is another one of these things, I've seen this happen, or this can very likely happen. You have people, soldiers, who are going out to battle, but they take no preparation at all. Their swords are blunt, okay, they're dull. And the person with the sword pays no attention to the edge, right? Does not kilkal the panim. So panim is the edge of the sword, literally the face of the sword. And kilkal is the word where I kind of got stuck on. Kilkal usually means to destroy or to attack or to hurt. But I think in the context of iron, this is what I picked up from a lot of the commentaries, seems to say that in the context of iron, it's actually how you would say to sharpen the point, right? Because how do you sharpen something? Actually, and this is physically true. When you sharpen a blade, if you sharpen it properly, you're actually scraping away small, atomic or molecular levels of the actual metal. So you're actually, in a certain sense, you are destroying the metal as you sharpen it. That's why if you see, you go to a professional chefs over many, many years, because they sharpen their knives very often, their knives will actually shrink or get less usable over time, even if they continue to sharpen it. We had a fellow when I lived in Phoenix for a little bit. I knew a fellow, he was a 90-something-year-old man, but he was a shochet. He was a slaughter. He did ritual slaughter for kosher, and his knife that he had forever, you could see how over many, many years it was a lot shorter in certain places because he was sharpening it constantly. So in this sense, kilkal actually means to sharpen the blade. So you have a soldier who walks into battle with a blunt blade, no one's sharpened it, meaning totally unprepared for battle, and nevertheless, the soldiers win. What he's saying over here is, you want to say from all the last couple of verses that it's all in preparation. Well, obviously, you have to prepare. He says, actually, I've seen cases where preparation makes no difference. I've seen cases where people are prepared, they take the precautions, and nothing doesn't happen. They're not safe. I've seen cases where people don't take any precautions. They don't prepare at all, and they're also then they're and they're fine. They win the battle. In other words, you want to blame everything on preparation. He's saying to the reader. So you're looking at those last couple verses and saying, "Oh, it's all because they didn't prepare properly." So preparation has nothing to do with it either, right? Preparation is itself its own. It's something, but it doesn't answer for everything, because you see cases where it's the opposite, where no preparation has led to still everything goes fine. So it's not all about preparation. He throws in at the end that wisdom still dictates that a person should engage in preparation. V'yitron hachsher, and the more preparation is chachma, is a sign of wisdom. So he's not saying don't prepare. He's not saying don't take precautions and make sure that what you're doing is safe. On the contrary, he says that's still the way of the wise person. But he is also, in his kind of lament over here, he's saying that it does seem to be that there's this dichotomy. There's this, it still doesn't match what's supposed to be, how things are supposed to be. I see situations where people are fully prepared, and the guy digging the pit still falls into the pit. And I see situations where people are not prepared and they're perfectly fine. So I'm not willing to say that everything is just human error. He's saying, on the contrary, there are times where, for us, it would appear that there is almost an injustice being served, potentially a divine injustice being served to people. And he is saying that I'm willing to engage with that question. Okay, that's the overall point, is that as a wise person, he's willing to engage with that question and to be okay with that. Because again, I think that's an important point for wisdom also. And in our long discussion of how to find wisdom or how to achieve it, is he's saying that there's also something to having a question being and living with a question for a little bit. We're not quite done with this. He's got one or two more of these verses, which we'll get to next week, God willing. But that's the general theme. Just so I could throw it in here, the sages point out that this they understand this verse is kind of a veiled reference to students when the students are trying to understand something. He says if the iron is blunt, meaning if the student is not able to understand the information. So the way the sages learn it is that it's because they don't have enough friends, or because they don't have a good teacher who smiles at them and teaches them in a warm way. They learn the phrase "v'hulo fanim kilkal," meaning to say that they don't have social interaction. And therefore, if you really want to help the child out, if you have a student who's not doing well in school, as the sages are, that's kind of a big focus of theirs. If you have a student who's not doing well in school, you're going to want to improve their social interaction, get them more friends, get them a better teacher who's going to engage with them in a lighter, more happy, engaging way. And then the chayalim yigaber, then the soldiers, the students will strengthen. And they learn that this final thing at the end is saying, and all the more so if we just did this originally. Meaning, don't wait for a child to be in a bad situation. Not just child, adult, anybody. Don't wait to be stuck in a situation where things aren't okay. Incorporate this into your curriculum from the very beginning. Happiness, good mood, good social interaction. So I thought that was an interesting, good lesson to walk away with also. Okay, we are back in the main screen. Thank you for joining us tonight. God willing, we should be back next week. I believe we should finish this kind of series of verses next week, and then we'll probably move it into another